As of December 2025, Venezuela sits at a breaking point. The country with the world's largest proven oil reserves is experiencing its worst crisis in modern history. Over 7 million people have fled. That's nearly a quarter of the population. And now, the question everyone's asking, will the United States intervene militarily? This isn't speculation. U.S. military assets are already positioned in the region. Economic pressure is intensifying. And the geopolitical stakes, oil security, Chinese influence, regional stability, have never been higher. This is Crisis Chronicles. Today we're analyzing what's really happening in Venezuela, how we got here, and the 4 most likely scenarios for what comes next. Because this crisis isn't just about one country, it's a test case for how great powers handle failing states in their backyard. Let's start with where things stand right now. Nicolas Maduro remains in power despite international pressure. His government claims Venezuela is under economic warfare by the United States. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, argues the July 2024 presidential election was fraudulent and continues to challenge his legitimacy. The numbers tell a stark story. Venezuela's economy has contracted by approximately 75% since 2013, one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in recorded history. Inflation reached 360% in 2024. Oil production, which once exceeded 3 million barrels per day, now struggles to reach 800,000 barrels daily. The humanitarian crisis is staggering. According to the UN Refugee Agency, over 7.7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2014. Colombia alone hosts approximately 2.9 million Venezuelan refugees. The migration wave has destabilized neighboring countries and reached the U.S. southern border, making this a regional crisis, not just a Venezuelan one. In recent months, tensions have escalated. The U.S. Treasury Department imposed new sanctions in November 2025 targeting Venezuelan oil exports to China. This is significant. It directly challenges one of Maduro's last economic lifelines. China responded by condemning the sanctions as unilateral bullying and reaffirmed support for Venezuela. Meanwhile, Colombia's president has called for regional dialogue. Brazil maintains diplomatic relations but distances itself from Maduro. And perhaps most telling, U.S. military exercises in the Caribbean have increased by 40% compared to 2024, according to Pentagon statements. The question isn't whether Venezuela is in crisis. That's undeniable. The question is what happens next, and whether external powers will determine Venezuela's future. To understand how Venezuela reached this point, we need to go back to 1999. When Hugo Chavez took power, Venezuela was already heavily dependent on oil, but the economy was relatively stable. Chavez nationalized the oil industry, expelled foreign companies, and used oil revenues to fund massive social programs. When oil prices were high, reaching $140 per barrel in 2008, this model seemed to work. But the system was fundamentally unsustainable. Instead of diversifying the economy, Chavez doubled down on oil dependency. State-owned enterprises were mismanaged. Corruption flourished. And when Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro inherited a country that was already showing cracks. Then in 2014, oil prices crashed. Venezuela's economy went into freefall. By 2015, shortages of basic goods became routine. Hyperinflation set in by 2017. The government responded not with economic reform, but with authoritarian measures, suppressing protests, arresting opposition leaders, and consolidating power. In 2019, the crisis went international. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president. Approximately 60 countries followed. It seemed like regime change was imminent, but it didn't happen. Maduro retained control of the military, and crucially, he had support from Russia and China, both heavily invested in keeping him in power. The U.S. imposed severe sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil sector. According to analysis by the Council on Foreign Relations, these sanctions cut off approximately $11 billion in annual oil revenue. The goal was to financially strangle the Maduro government. But here's what the sanctions also did. They pushed Venezuela deeper into the arms of China and Russia. Beijing became the primary buyer of Venezuelan oil through complicated workarounds. Moscow provided military support and cybersecurity assistance. Iran sent fuel and technicians despite its own sanctions. By 2025, we have a geopolitical standoff. Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a failed state backed by America's primary adversaries, sitting on top of 300 billion barrels of oil, just 1,000 miles from Florida. This isn't just about Venezuela anymore. It's about great power competition playing out in Latin America. Let's break down who's involved and what they actually want, because the stated positions and real interests often diverge significantly. The United States. Publicly, the U.S. position is about democracy and human rights. But let's be clear about the actual strategic interests. Energy security, countering Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere, and managing the migration crisis that's reached U.S. borders. The U.S. has multiple forms of leverage: comprehensive economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, military capabilities through Southern Command, and support for regional opposition. According to State Department officials, approximately $3.5 billion in Venezuelan government assets remain frozen in U.S. banks. The American Red Line appears to be a permanent Chinese or Russian military base in Venezuela. That would fundamentally alter the Caribbean security environment and violate long-standing U.S. doctrine about the Western Hemisphere. China. Beijing's public stance is non-interference in internal affairs and mutual respect between nations. The reality is more complex. China has loaned Venezuela approximately $60 billion since 2007, money that's repaid in oil shipments, if it gets repaid at all. China's leverage is financial dependency. Venezuela needs Chinese loans, equipment, and most importantly, a buyer for its oil that won't comply with U.S. sanctions. But China's red line is protecting its investments. If Venezuela completely collapses, or if a new government repudiates Chinese debt, Beijing loses billions. Russia. Moscow's interest in Venezuela is less about direct economic gain. Russian trade with Venezuela is relatively small, and more about geopolitical positioning. Supporting Maduro gives Russia a foothold in America's backyard, much like the U.S. has done near Russian borders. Russia provides military advisors, cybersecurity support, and diplomatic cover in international forums. But Russia's leverage has weakened significantly. The war in Ukraine has stretched Russian resources thin. Moscow can offer political support, but probably not the financial bailout Venezuela needs. Regional powers. Colombia has the most at stake. 2.9 million Venezuelan refugees have crossed its border, straining social services and causing political tension. Colombia's current government maintains diplomatic relations but wants a negotiated solution, not military intervention that could destabilize the border further. Brazil, under various governments, has consistently opposed military intervention while also refusing to fully embrace Maduro. Brazil's interest is regional stability and maintaining South American independence from U.S. military action. The Maduro government. For Maduro and his inner circle, this is existential. They're not just fighting for political power, they're fighting to avoid potential prosecution for corruption, human rights abuses, and drug trafficking. U.S. prosecutors have indicted Venezuelan officials on narcotics charges. This means Maduro's red line is survival. He'll accept almost any external support, Chinese, Russian, Iranian, or otherwise, to stay in power. So what actually happens next? Let's examine 4 realistic scenarios based on historical precedent and current trajectory. Scenario 1. Negotiated transition. 35% likelihood. In this scenario, international pressure, economic pain, military isolation, and fractures within Maduro's coalition leads to negotiations. Key military leaders receive guarantees of amnesty or safe exile. A transitional government takes power with international oversight. How we get there? A major defection from within Maduro's inner circle, or guarantees from the U.S. and regional powers that convince the military it's safer to transition than to fight. Historical precedent. This is similar to how some authoritarian transitions occurred in Chile, Argentina, and more recently, the attempted transition in Nicaragua in 2018. Though that failed. The challenge. Maduro has survived this pressure for years. Why would it work now? Unless something fundamentally changes, like China withdrawing support or a complete economic collapse that triggers military splits, a negotiated transition remains difficult. Scenario 2. Limited U.S. military intervention. 15% likelihood. This doesn't mean an Iraq-style invasion. Instead, think targeted operations, enforcing an oil blockade, protecting humanitarian corridors, or supporting Colombian border security with U.S. military assets. Trigger events. A major humanitarian catastrophe, like a Maduro crackdown causing mass casualties, or evidence of Venezuelan government involvement in terrorism or drug trafficking that directly threatens U.S. security. Historical precedent. U.S. interventions in Panama in 1989, Grenada in 1983, or the naval blockade of Cuba in 1962 provide models for limited military action. The risk, even limited intervention, can escalate. Regional governments might oppose it. China and Russia could provide direct military support to Venezuela, and the U.S. public, after Iraq and Afghanistan, has limited appetite for new interventions. Scenario 3. Slow deterioration and partition. 40% likelihood. This is actually the most likely scenario in the near term. Venezuela doesn't collapse overnight, but it doesn't stabilize either. Instead, it continues deteriorating, with different regions falling under different controls. What this looks like? Maduro controls Caracas and the core governmental apparatus. Border regions near Colombia become increasingly autonomous or criminally controlled. Eastern oil regions might effectively be run by Chinese companies protecting their investments. Historical precedent. Syria after 2012, Libya after 2014, Yemen currently, states that exist on paper but are divided in practice. Why this is likely? It requires the least action from external powers. The U.S. can maintain sanctions without military risk. China protects its oil interests regionally. Colombia manages its border. And everyone avoids the costs and risks of intervention. The danger. This creates a permanent failed state breeding ground for criminal organizations, refugee flows, and potential terrorist safe havens, 1,000 miles from the United States. Scenario 4. Maduro consolidation, 10% likelihood. The scenario where Maduro not only survives but consolidates power seems unlikely, but isn't impossible. How it happens? Oil prices spike dramatically due to global crisis, Middle East war, major supply disruption. This provides Venezuela with massive new revenues. Chinese support increases, the opposition fractures. Regional countries, exhausted by the refugee crisis, accept Maduro in exchange for limited reforms. Historical precedent. The Cuban model. Isolated, sanctioned, but surviving for decades with external support. Why it's unlikely? Even with higher oil prices, Venezuela's oil infrastructure is so degraded that it can't quickly ramp up production. The humanitarian crisis is too severe for simple revenue injection to solve. And unlike Cuba in 1960, the modern world is more interconnected. Isolation is harder to maintain. If you're watching from outside Latin America, you might wonder why Venezuela matters to you personally. First, energy markets. Venezuela holds 18% of the world's proven oil reserves. A complete collapse or a conflict that takes Venezuelan oil off the market would impact global prices within days. That affects everything from fuel costs to food prices to inflation worldwide. Second, this is a test case for great power competition. How the US, China, and Russia handle Venezuela sets precedent for how they'll approach similar situations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. If China successfully backs a failing regime against US pressure in Latin America, what does that mean for Taiwan, for Ukraine, for other flashpoints? Third, the humanitarian aspect. 7 million refugees is Europe's Syrian crisis-level migration, but in the Americas. This isn't just a regional issue. Venezuelan migrants have reached as far as Chile, Mexico, and the United States. Migration reshapes politics in every country it touches. Finally, this matters for what it tells us about the changing world order. For decades, the Western Hemisphere was considered uncontested U.S. influence. Venezuela demonstrates that era is ending. Regional powers and global competitors now actively challenge U.S. dominance in its own neighborhood. The Venezuela crisis is a window into the multipolar world we're entering, where failed states become battlegrounds for global power competition, where humanitarian crises and strategic interests collide, and where there are no easy answers. So what should we watch for next? 3 key indicators will tell us which scenario is unfolding. First, watch Chinese financial support. If Beijing reduces loans or investment, Maduro's days are numbered. Second, monitor the Venezuelan military. Any major defections signal regime fragility. Third, track U.S. military positioning. Increased exercises and asset deployment suggest intervention preparation. The Venezuela crisis won't be resolved quickly, but understanding the history, the players, and the possible futures helps us see past the headlines to what's really at stake. This is Crisis Chronicles. We'll continue tracking this situation as it develops. If you want to understand these global flashpoints before they explode, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next week, we're examining another critical crisis, Syria's post-Assad power vacuum and what it means for the Middle East. What do you think will happen in Venezuela? Especially if you're from the region or have direct knowledge, share your perspective in the comments. This is Crisis Chronicles. Stay informed.